The year was 1907, and the world was in the middle of change. In rural America, where sprawling fields stretched endlessly beneath skies of unforgiving sun and sudden storms, life moved slower than in the cities, yet hardship clung tightly to every acre of soil. Families depended on their farms not just for income, but for survival. Every harvest determined whether there would be bread on the table or hunger in the winter. In one such small farming town, a family prepared to do something unusual for that Eerie. They were about to have their portrait taken. Photographs were not everyday occurrences. They were rare treasures. The cost alone was enough to make farmers hesitate, but the family wanted to mark a moment in their lives, a memory to leave behind for the future. The photographer, a traveling man with a wooden tripod and a black cloth, arrived by wagon. He unpacked his heavy camera carefully, as though it were a piece of delicate machinery from another world. Children gathered around curiously, their bare feet coated with the dust of the summer road. The father, sunburned and broad-shouldered from decades of working the plow, insisted that everyone wear their best clothes, though for farmers that meant mended shirts, stiff collars, and dresses faded from repeated washings. The mother brushed the children's hair neatly and tied back her own, determined that, in this one photograph, the world would see not just their struggles but their dignity. They stood in front of their farmhouse, a small structure of wood and brick, patched together with years of labor. Behind them stretched the field's acres of golden wheat and corn, tall enough to sway gently in the breeze. The photographer fussed over his equipment, calling instructions that the children barely understood. "Stand still. No smiles unless you can hold them steady," he said. In those days, smiles were rare in photographs, not because people lacked joy, but because the long exposure time made it difficult to hold a grin without blurring. The family took their positions. The father placed one calloused hand on the shoulder of his eldest daughter. The younger children clutched their mother's skirt. They looked into the camera with wide, solemn eyes, as though staring not into a lens, but into the future. And yet, the photograph captured more than just the family. In the background, almost as an afterthought, stood a scarecrow. At first glance, it was like any other, a figure erected in the field to ward off hungry birds. Its outstretched arms wore an old flannel shirt, and its head was covered with a wide-brimmed hat that had long since lost its shape. To most eyes, it would have been nothing more than a practical farm tool, barely worth noticing. But when the photograph was later developed, something about the scarecrow seemed strangely unsettling. Its posture was too lifelike, the way the shoulders slumped slightly forward, the way the clothes appeared not just stuffed with straw, but fitted around a frame. It was as if the scarecrow itself had paused, mid-gesture, to join the family in their picture. Neighbors who saw the photograph commented quietly, some unbothered, others disturbed. The scarecrow looked too human. Some said it reminded them of someone who used to work in the fields, a young man whose presence had once been a daily part of the family's life. The truth was known only within the family. The scarecrow was not just a bundle of straw thrown together to keep crows at bay. It was a symbol, a memorial. The shirt that hung on its shoulders was not random. It had belonged to the family's eldest son, a boy of 16, who had died the year before in a tragic accident while helping his father cut wood near the edge of the property. A falling tree had crushed him, and with no money for a headstone and little ground to spare for a proper grave, the family had buried him quietly in a corner of the field. The scarecrow, built soon after his death, was clothed in his belongings. For the grieving mother, it was a way of keeping her boy close. Every morning when she looked out at the fields, she did not see a faceless effigy. She saw the outline of her son standing watch over the crops he had once worked beside them. The children, too young to fully understand death, often waved at it as though their brother might wave back. On the day of the photograph, no one thought much of it. The scarecrow had become such a familiar presence that it was almost like another member of the household. But once captured on film, its shadowed form told a deeper story, of loss, of survival, of how a family stitched strength from sorrow. The photographer, unaware of the secret, had unwittingly recorded not just faces, but an entire history of resilience in one frame. The father's stoic stance, the mother's calm but tired expression, the children's innocence, and behind them, the silent figure of the Scarecrow, holding the memory of the boy they had lost. When the family looked at the developed photo weeks later, their emotions were mixed. Pride, because they finally had an image to show their future grandchildren, proof of who they were and how they had lived. Pain, because the photograph reminded them of the absence that still haunted their home. And yet, that photograph became something greater than a memory. It became a lesson in resilience. It told anyone who looked closely that life is never just about the smiles we show. It is also about the sorrows we endure, the secrets we carry, and the strength we find to keep moving forward. For the family, that picture became a silent vow that though tragedy had struck them, they would not let despair consume them. They would work harder, stay united, and raise the younger children into strong men and women who could face the storms of life with courage. The photograph, faded now with age, remains more than an image of a farming family in 1907. It is a symbol that life always leaves us with a choice to hide our pain or to transform it into resilience. Behind the straight faces and worn clothes, the photograph captured not just a family, but the story of love, loss, and unshakable strength. Life in rural America in the early 1900s was often painted in pictures of golden fields, red barns, and smiling families. But behind those nostalgic images lay a truth that was far harsher. For farmers in 1907, every sunrise brought not only the hope of harvest but also the weight of uncertainty, exhaustion, and survival. Unlike today, when grocery stores overflow with abundance, families back then depended almost entirely on the crops they grew and the animals they raised. A good season meant food in the pantry and a small income from selling surplus at the market. A bad season could mean hunger, debt, or even the loss of the farm itself, and in 1907, bad seasons were more common than anyone wished to admit. From the break of dawn, the farm demanded attention. The father, already weary from years of plowing, rose before the sun. His hands, calloused and cracked, gripped the wooden handle of tools worn smooth by labor. Each furrow in the soil was carved with sweat. Horses or mules pulled the heavy plows, their sides heaving as they turned the earth over for planting. The children, too, were not spared from toil. From the age of 6 or 7, they carried buckets, herded chickens, weeded the garden, and hauled water. Schooling was often secondary. Education stopped when harvest began. A boy who could guide a plow straight or repair a fence was far more valuable in the eyes of necessity than a boy who could recite his lessons. The mother bore her own burdens. She cooked 3 meals a day over a wood stove, scrubbed clothes by hand in steaming water, and mended garments until fabric grew too thin to hold another patch. Beyond the housework, she also tended to the garden, milked the cow, and cared for sick children without the aid of doctors. Every member of the family was a worker. To stop was to fall behind, and to fall behind was to risk losing everything. The greatest enemy of the farmer was not laziness, nor even poverty, but nature itself. Rain could bless or betray. Some years the heavens opened too freely, drowning fields in mud. Other years, drought turned fertile land into dust, leaving crops shriveled and useless. Storms arrived without warning, tearing through fields with hail that shredded corn leaves and wind that snapped young wheat stalks in half. Locusts sometimes came in clouds, so thick they darkened the sky, devouring months of labor in hours. There were no government programs to provide relief, no insurance policies to cover losses. A single bad year meant borrowing from neighbors or from the local storekeeper, often at high interest. Too many bad years meant foreclosure. For many families, losing the farm meant losing identity, pride, and hope. In 1907, medical care in rural areas was nearly non-existent. Doctors were few, hospitals were far, and medicine was expensive. When illness struck, families relied on home remedies, prayers, and endurance. Childhood diseases that today are easily treated, measles, influenza, pneumonia, could claim lives within days. Injuries were common on farms: a cut from a rusty tool, a fall from a wagon, or a crushed limb beneath a horse's hooves. Without modern antibiotics or emergency care, even a minor wound could turn deadly. Families lived with the constant awareness that life was fragile. Every cough, every fever carried fear. Parents knew that children were blessings, but also that they might not live to see adulthood. Farming families often lived miles from their nearest neighbor. Travel was done by horse and wagon, making even short distances long journeys. Isolation weighed heavily on people, especially during the long winters when snow buried roads and cut families off from the outside world. Loneliness was not just physical but emotional. There were few opportunities for entertainment, conversation, or leisure. Letters took weeks to arrive. Newspapers, when they came, carried stories of a fast-changing world. Electricity in cities, new inventions, talk of industry and progress. But for farmers, life remained stubbornly the same. This isolation often bred strength and self-reliance, but it could also bring despair. Families leaned on one another for comfort, but sometimes silence filled the air heavier than words. And yet, despite all of these struggles, farmers endured. There was pride in the sweat-soaked shirts, in the blisters that proved a day's labor, in the barns filled with hay at season's end. Each loaf of bread baked from wheat grown with one's own hands carried a taste richer than gold. Children may have grown up quickly, but they also learned responsibility, resilience, and the value of hard work. Families learned to share what little they had, to celebrate small victories. A healthy calf, a bushel more corn than last year, a safe return from the fields at sunset. The struggles were real, but so was the strength they forged. Survival was not guaranteed, but determination made it possible. This is why the Scarecrow in the 1907 photograph stood out so powerfully. To outsiders, it was a simple farm tool. To the family, it embodied their struggles, a reminder that even in death, even in loss, they must keep working, keep planting, keep hoping. That Scarecrow, dressed in their son's clothes, was more than just a figure to chase away birds. It was a symbol of the reality of rural life. That hardship was woven into every acre of soil, but so too was love, memory, and resilience. Looking back, we may see these lives as harsh and unforgiving, but they also reveal something timeless, the ability of ordinary people to endure extraordinary struggles. Farmers in 1907 faced hunger, storms, illness, and grief, yet they pressed forward because stopping meant surrender. Today, when life overwhelms us with challenges, financial worries, health issues, loneliness, their story reminds us that struggle does not mean defeat. It means we are alive, and that we are being shaped into stronger, more resilient people. The reality of rural struggles in 1907 is not so different from the struggles we face now. The tools and times may have changed, but the human spirit that endures hardship and rises again has not. The Scarecrow had always been there. At least, that's how it seemed to the neighbors. To anyone passing by the farm, it was just another figure standing guard in the fields, its wide, brimmed hat drooping over an empty face, its arms stretched outward as though to ward off the black crows that circled overhead. At a distance, it was nothing unusual. Every farm had one, but to the family in the 1907 photograph, the Scarecrow was not simply a bundle of straw dressed in old rags. It was a secret, one both painful and sacred, one that spoke silently of tragedy, love, and endurance. A year before the photograph was taken, the family's eldest son, Samuel, had been the pride of his father. At just 16, he was already as tall and broad as a man, his hands strong from holding the plow and carrying bales of hay. He had inherited his mother's gentle eyes and his father's stubbornness, and he carried both with quiet determination. Samuel was the kind of boy who never complained, even when his back ached from long hours in the sun. He dreamed of one day owning his own plot of land, of raising wheat and corn that would feed not only his family but others in need. His younger siblings adored him. They followed him into the fields, eager to mimic his movements, laughing when he pretended to trip or sang songs to pass the time. But farm life, for all its beauty, was unforgiving. One autumn afternoon, as the father and son worked together felling trees for winter firewood, tragedy struck. A misjudged cut, a sudden shift in the wind, and a massive trunk came crashing down. The father shouted, but too late. When the dust settled, Samuel lay beneath the tree. There were no ambulances to call, no hospital within reach. The boy was gone before they could even lift him free. The father carried him back to the house, his strong arms trembling as though he were made of glass. The mother collapsed, her cries echoing across the fields. The younger children clung to one another, confused, frightened, unable to understand why their brother would not rise again. Death was not uncommon in rural life, but that did not make it easier to bear. The family had no money for a coffin, no polished stone to mark his grave. They dug into the earth themselves, at the edge of the field, where Samuel had once worked with pride. They laid him there with nothing but a simple wooden cross fashioned from 2 planks. But grief does not end with burial. The father could not walk past the stump of the fallen tree without feeling the weight of guilt. The mother, staring at her son's empty bed each night, found her hands trembling when she tried to sue. And the children, though young, asked questions that pierced the heart. Where did Samuel go? Why doesn't he come back? The house was quieter without him. The evenings seemed longer. The father, though a man of few words, carried his sorrow in silence, but the mother could not bear the emptiness. She needed something, anything, to keep her son near. It was she who first thought of the Scarecrow. One morning, while gathering clothes for washing, she came across Samuel's work shirt, the one he had worn nearly every day the summer before. The fabric was frayed at the cuffs, patched at the elbows, and still faintly smelled of sweat and earth. Her hands lingered on it, unwilling to fold it away. Instead, she carried it to the field. There stood the Scarecrow, half falling apart from neglect, its arms drooping, its hat torn. Slowly, carefully, she dressed it in Samuel's shirt. She found his worn trousers, the ones too small for the father to wear, and tied them to the Scarecrow's wooden frame. She even placed his old boots at its base, the soles nearly worn through from miles walked in the furrows. When she stepped back, her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, in the shimmering heat of the field, it looked as though Samuel himself stood there once more, shoulders squared, head tilted, watching over the wheat as he always had. The younger children, seeing it later, did not cry. Instead they smiled. "Look," one whispered, "Samuel's still here. He's guarding the farm." And so the Scarecrow became more than a tool. It became a guardian, a memorial, a silent companion. Each morning the mother greeted it as she tended the garden. The father, though he said nothing, often paused at the edge of the field, his eyes fixed on its outline against the horizon. Neighbors noticed, of course. Some found it strange, even unsettling, that the Scarecrow was dressed in real clothes, with boots planted firmly in the soil. Others, kinder at heart, said nothing but understood. In a time when few could afford luxuries, grief found its own ways of expression. Children from nearby farms whispered stories. That the Scarecrow moved at night, that it turned its head when no one was looking, that Samuel's spirit lingered there, chasing away not only crows, but any evil that dared approach the family's land. Whether out of superstition or respect, no one dared to mock it openly. When the photographer arrived in 1907, the Scarecrow had already been standing nearly a year. By then, the family no longer thought twice about its presence. To them, it was simply part of the farm, as natural as the barn or the well. So when they posed for their photograph in front of the house, no one thought to move it. The Scarecrow stood in the background, its shirt slightly faded, its hat casting a shadow. Only later, when the picture was developed, did outsiders truly notice it. In the black and white image, its shape was too clear, too human. It stood not like an object, but like a silent figure included in the family portrait. Those who knew the story lowered their eyes, whispering prayers. Those who did not felt a shiver of unease, sensing there was something unspoken in that image. To the family, however, the Scarecrow was never about fear. It was about love. It was about remembering that Samuel's hands had once worked these fields, that his sweat had nourished this soil. By dressing the Scarecrow in his clothes, they refused to let his memory fade into silence. And in time, the Scarecrow became something more. It was no longer just a memorial of death, but a symbol of endurance. The family worked harder, not only for survival, but to honor the boy who could no longer share their burdens. When storms came, when drought threatened, they told themselves, "Samuel is still watching. We cannot give up." The Scarecrow's secret teaches us something vital. Grief can destroy, or it can transform. Pain can break us, or it can be turned into strength. This family, with no wealth, no means, and no way to erase their loss, chose to carry Samuel with them, not in despair, but in determination. They did not build monuments or carve names into marble. Instead, they dressed a scarecrow in his clothes and let him stand guard over their dreams. And in doing so, they found a way to move forward, to heal, and to endure. Grief is a strange companion. It enters suddenly, unwelcome and heavy, and yet it never fully leaves. For the farming family of 1907, the death of Samuel had cast a long shadow over their home and fields. His absence was felt in every corner, in the empty chair at the table, in the silence of the evenings, in the sight of his tools resting unused by the barn door. But grief, while powerful, is not always destructive. For some, it is a weight that crushes the spirit. For others, it becomes fuel, a reminder that every day lived is a day to honor those who can no longer live. This family chose the latter. The father, a man hardened by years behind the plow, carried guilt as well as sorrow. He had been there when Samuel died, working beside him. In quiet moments, he replayed that day in his mind, the sound of the axe, the crack of the tree, the sickening silence afterward. He wondered if he could have shouted louder, moved faster, saved his son. But instead of letting guilt paralyze him, he turned it into resolve. He rose earlier than before, pushing himself harder in the fields. Each row of corn, each bushel of wheat harvested became an offering, not just to feed his family, but to honor Samuel's memory. He told himself, "If my boy cannot finish his work, I will finish it for him." Neighbors noticed his determination. Where others might have fallen into despair, he grew more steadfast. His back bent under heavier loads, but his spirit did not bend. Grief had not broken him. It had reforged him into a man who worked not only for survival but for love. The mother bore her grief differently. While the father turned to labor, she turned to nurturing. Her loss had left an ache that no amount of work could fill, but she refused to let it consume her children. She poured her energy into the household, making sure that laughter still echoed within those walls. Every meal she cooked, every garment she mended, carried with it a sense of care deeper than before. She taught the younger children to be grateful for what they had, to appreciate one another, to remember their brother not with tears but with stories. At night, she would tell them tales of Samuel, his kindness, his hard work, his dreams for the future. Instead of letting him fade into silence, she wove him into their lives, keeping his memory alive not as a wound, but as an inspiration. For her, grief became a teacher. It taught her the importance of cherishing every moment, of holding her children close, of finding strength in love rather than despair. The younger children, though still innocent, were deeply shaped by the tragedy. At first, they struggled with confusion. Why had Samuel been taken? Why did life seem so unfair? But under the guidance of their parents, they began to understand that life was fragile and precious. They worked harder in the fields, not because they were forced, but because they wanted to help fill the gap their brother had left. Each carried within them a piece of Samuel's spirit. His kindness, his resilience, his dreams. The eldest daughter, only 14, stepped into a role of quiet leadership. She helped her mother with the younger siblings, soothed the baby when he cried, and carried water from the well without complaint. The younger boys took up Samuel's chores, clumsy at first but determined to learn. For them, grief became motivation. They wanted to honor their brother by becoming strong, dependable, and united. Every day as the family worked, the Scarecrow stood in the field, dressed in Samuel's clothes, a silent sentinel. To others it was eerie, to them it was a reminder. Whenever fatigue set in, whenever the sun burned too hot or the soil resisted the plow, they looked toward the Scarecrow and felt renewed strength. It was as if Samuel himself watched over them, urging them on in, "Do not give up. I am still here with you. Keep going." In this way, the Scarecrow was more than a symbol of loss. It became a symbol of resilience, a physical embodiment of turning grief into strength. The family's determination did not go unnoticed. Neighbors who at first pitied them soon came to admire them. When others faltered under poor harvests or illness, this family remained steadfast. They began to help others, sharing what little they could. If a neighbor's horse went lame, the father lent his. If a widow needed wood for winter, the children helped chop and haul. The mother, known for her warm bread, often baked extra loaves for families struggling more than her own. In giving to others, they found healing for themselves. Their grief no longer isolated them. It connected them to their community. They showed that sorrow could be transformed into service, and in doing so, they earned respect and gratitude that lasted for years. By the time the next harvest came, their farm flourished in a way it never had before. The crops grew tall and strong, the livestock thrived, and the family worked together with a unity that amazed even themselves. The father credited Samuel. "He's still with us," he would say, nodding toward the Scarecrow. "He's the reason these fields are strong." The truth was simpler. Their grief had driven them to work harder, to pull together, to never waste a moment. What had seemed like an unbearable loss had, in a strange way, made them stronger than they had ever been. This story is not just about a family in 1907. It is about all of us. Every person faces grief, loss, or hardship at some point. The question is not whether pain will come, it always does, but what we will do with it when it arrives. We can let it bury us, or we can let it build us. We can sink into despair, or we can rise with determination. The family in that photograph chose to rise. They turned their grief into strength, their pain into purpose. They honored the memory of the son they lost by living with more love, more resilience, more unity. And so can we. The years after Samuel's death were not easy ones. The world outside the farm was changing quickly. Cities were expanding, factories were roaring to life, and new technologies like electricity and automobiles promised a future of speed and convenience. But for families like this one, rooted in the soil of 1907 America, life remained grounded in the rhythm of seasons, the turning of the plow, the sowing of seed, and the gathering of harvest. And yet, amid their sorrow, the family carved out a new way of living, one that was not defined by tragedy, but by resilience. What began as survival slowly grew into legacy. In the years immediately following Samuel's death, many predicted the family would struggle to keep their land. Losing a strong son meant losing labor, and farming was unforgiving to those who fell behind. But instead of decline, their farm thrived. The father poured himself into the soil with renewed intensity. Each furrow plowed was deeper, straighter, and more precise than before. He often said, "I work for two now, myself and my boy." His hands bore the scars of endless labor, but his heart carried a quiet fire. The mother became the backbone of the household. She managed the children with discipline and compassion, ensuring they were not only workers but learners. She taught them thrift, how to make meals from scraps, how to reuse every cloth and nail, how to find value in what others discarded. The children, hardened by necessity, grew into capable hands far earlier than their peers. Where once they might have quarreled or shirked chores, they now worked with unity, each one determined to carry Samuel's spirit forward in their own way. And so, the farm did not fail, it prospered. Year after year, the crops grew fuller, the livestock multiplied, and the barn filled with hay that promised security through harsh winters. Beyond their own land, the family began to be known throughout the county for their strength. When other farmers faced hardship, they came to this family for advice or assistance. And more often than not, help was given. Whether in the form of borrowed tools, a horse to pull a broken plow, or hands to harvest before a storm, the father, once quiet and private, became a man others respected deeply. People said he had iron in his will. The mother was admired for her generosity, often baking extra bread to deliver to struggling neighbors. Their children, disciplined and hardworking, were known for their reliability. The story of their Scarecrow spread quietly as well. Though the family never spoke of it openly, many who saw it understood its meaning. Over time, it came to symbolize not eerie grief, but steadfast resilience. The sight of that figure in the field reminded others that even the deepest losses could be carried with dignity. As the years passed, the younger children grew. The eldest daughter married a neighboring farmer and carried with her the lessons of her childhood: endurance, unity, and the power of turning pain into perseverance. She taught her own children that life would always bring hardship, but that hardship was never the end. The younger sons took over more of the farm work as their father aged. They carried Samuel's spirit with them, often glancing toward the Scarecrow before long days of labor. For them, it was not just a reminder of loss, but a symbol of responsibility, to continue what their brother had started, to ensure that the farm remained strong. Even the youngest, who had been barely more than a toddler when Samuel died, grew up hearing his story retold not as tragedy, but as inspiration. She learned that resilience was not a choice made once, but a practice lived every day. Eventually, the Scarecrow itself began to wither. The sun faded the shirt, the wind tore at the trousers, the boots cracked and collapsed. After years of standing guard, the figure no longer resembled the boy it once honored. One spring, the father quietly took it down. He gathered the pieces and laid them gently in the soil near Samuel's grave. Then he built a new Scarecrow, this one dressed in rough rags without the weight of memory. But by then, the family no longer needed the symbol. The strength it had given them lived in their hearts. Samuel's presence was no longer bound to a figure in the field. It had become part of their blood, their character, their very way of living. By the time the family posed for another photograph years later, they looked transformed. The children stood tall, the parents proud. Behind them stretched not only fertile fields, but a life rebuilt from sorrow. This time, no Scarecrow stood in the background. It was not needed. The true Scarecrow, the true guardian, had become their resilience. Invisible, but ever present. When people asked the father how they had survived such loss, he always said the same words, "Because we never let death kill our hope." The family's story did not end with them. The children grew into adults who carried their parents' lessons into new generations. They told their own children about Samuel, not with tears, but with pride. They spoke of how his death had nearly broken them, and how instead it had forged them into people of strength. Those children grew up knowing that hardship was not something to fear, but something to face. They spread across the land, some farming, some seeking new opportunities in growing towns, but all carried the same legacy that grief can be transformed and resilience can be inherited. The photograph of 1907, with the Scarecrow in the background, became a treasured heirloom. Each generation looked at it with awe, not for its somberness, but for what it represented. The moment a family chose strength over despair, unity over division, hope over hopelessness. A legacy of resilience is not built in comfort. It is built in hardship, in the long nights of sorrow, in the moments when surrender seems easier than standing tall. This family's story proves that pain need not be the end of a story. It can be the beginning of a stronger one. We too will face losses, of loved ones, of dreams, of certainties we once held dear. But we can choose how we respond. We can crumble, or we can carry forward, building something greater from the ashes of what we've lost. The legacy left by this family is not bound to their time or their fields. It belongs to all who believe that the human spirit can endure, that resilience can be passed down, that even grief can plant the seeds of hope. When we look at the faded photograph from 1907, the family lined up in front of their farmhouse, the Scarecrow standing silently in the background, it is tempting to see it only as a relic of the past, a reminder of how hard life used to be, a curiosity, maybe even a little eerie. But if we stop there, we miss the true message hidden in that image. The story of this family is not locked away in history. It speaks directly to us, to anyone who has felt loss, faced struggle, or stood on the edge of despair wondering how to go on. We may live in a different world now, one of electricity, technology, and instant communication, but hardship remains universal. In 1907, farmers battled drought, storms, and illness. Today, people battle debt, job insecurity, health crisis, and loneliness in fast-moving cities. The details change, but the weight is the same. Every generation faces struggles that feel insurmountable. Every family at some point walks through the valley of grief. Every individual sooner or later is confronted with loss. What matters is not the form the struggle takes, but how we respond to it. The family in the photograph had every reason to give up. They had lost a son, a brother, a worker whose hands were vital to their survival. Grief could have hollowed them out. The farm could have withered. They could have allowed despair to define them. But they chose differently. They chose to let their pain transform them. The father worked harder, the mother nurtured more deeply, the children carried responsibility earlier than most. Together, they turned grief into a driving force, building a farm and a family stronger than before. Their story reminds us that pain is not just a wound. It is also a tool. If we let it, pain can sharpen us, deepen us, and make us more compassionate and determined than we ever thought possible. The scarecrow behind the family was more than straw and cloth. It was a symbol. For them it represented their son, his memory, his spirit, his presence in the fields he once worked. For us today, symbols still matter. They may not take the form of scarecrows, but we all carry reminders of what we have lost. A photograph, a piece of clothing, a song that brings back a memory. These symbols can either trap us in sorrow or inspire us to keep going. The family chose inspiration. Every time they looked at the scarecrow, they did not see only death. They saw love. They saw endurance. They saw a reason to rise each morning and keep fighting. We can choose the same. Instead of letting reminders of loss crush us, we can let them fuel us. We can turn symbols into strength. No one survives grief alone. The family endured because they held on to each other. The father carried the weight of labor. The mother carried the weight of love, and the children carried the weight of responsibility. Alone, each might have faltered. Together, they became unbreakable. In our own time, we are often told to be independent, to face our struggles alone. But the truth remains, resilience is built in community. Whether that community is family, friends, or neighbors, strength multiplies when shared. The lesson is clear: if we want to endure, we must walk together. The father's words, repeated over the years, carried the essence of their survival, because we never let death kill our hope. Hope is not something that arrives easily. It must be chosen again and again, even when circumstances give us every reason to surrender. It is the act of looking at barren fields and believing in the next harvest. It is the act of burying a loved one and still choosing to plant seeds the next morning. Hope is not naive optimism. It is stubborn courage. It is the quiet refusal to let despair have the final word. And that is a choice we still face today. The legacy of this 1907 family is not measured in acres of wheat or years of survival. Their true legacy is the example they left: that grief can be endured, that hardship can be overcome, that love can outlast loss. Every time we are faced with a setback, their story whispers to us, you can rise again. You can turn sorrow into strength. You can build a legacy of resilience. The photograph may be more than a century old, but its lesson is timeless. In grief, when we lose someone dear, we can choose to honor them not just with tears, but with actions that carry their memory forward. In hardship, when life tests us with difficulties, we can remember that endurance today builds strength for tomorrow. In community, when we see others struggling, we can offer help, as this family did, turning pain into compassion. In hope, when despair whispers that it is easier to give up, we can look at their story and remember that hope, though fragile, can outlast even death. In the end, the photograph of the family and the scarecrow is not about death. It is about life. It is about the human spirit's ability to endure, to adapt, and to rise again no matter how heavy the burden. The family of 1907 may be long gone, but their choice still speaks. They remind us that resilience is not inherited, nor given freely. It is forged in the fire of hardship, chosen every day, lived with every breath. That is the lesson for us today.